Shalom and welcome to the European Report. Here we are in the heart of the European Union, in the European Parliament in Brussels, and in today's programme we'll be discussing the 74th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, known as International Holocaust Memorial Day, and we'll be posing the question, what lessons can the EU learn about the horrors that took place over 70 years ago on this continent. And this programme, I will be joined by Tomas Sandell, the founder and director of the European Coalition for Israel. And we'll be joined by Igor Gräzin, MEP from Estonia. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
And Charlotte Gutman, chairman of ORT Belgium, that has a network of over 150 high schools. So welcome to the programme in terms of education. Thomas, can you kindly just give us an update on some of the very important diplomatic activities that ECI have been involved in the last couple of months?
Thank you, Simon. I will keep that update very brief because I think today we need to dedicate the program in its entirety to the victims of the Holocaust. But perhaps looking back to what we did at the United Nations, I would call that Holocaust prevention. Because the work at the UN, which we did before Christmas, is really to reach out to the UN member states and explain why the Jewish communities have been such blessings to the nations where they've decided to live. And I just mentioned one example, which was Mexico. We don't normally relate Jewish life to Mexico so much, but the ambassador, he said that when the Jews came or were expelled from Portugal in the 16th century and some of them came to Mexico, they had to hide their identity, so they were crypto Jews. And it took Mexico some 400 years to realize that they were part of this influx of Portuguese. And they realized it when they could see that there were some parts of the country that did much better economically and socially and culturally, and these were the parts where the crypto Jews had settled, and they, like they did in so many other places like in the Netherlands, they really contributed in a very positive way. So I think this was a very good lesson for all of us to see that how the Jewish people, we should always embrace them and appreciate them and be grateful for what they have done to our civilization.
Superb story. I didn't know that one, so thank you for sharing that with us, Thomas. And Igor, you're our first representative from Estonia, and it's fantastic to have an Estonian MEP on the programme. Sadly, your nation, Estonia, was invaded by the Nazis in the summer of '41. Can you share with us what the Nazi occupation was like for the people of Estonia?
Well, particularly if we are going to talk about the Jewish population in Estonia, then Estonia has positive and negative sides at the same time. Estonia was awarded in 1932 International Jewish Award for establishing Jewish cultural autonomy. And we are very proud to have this award because it was signed by the chairman of Jewish Federation, Albert Einstein,
wow.
Who specifically said that it was very good and that was fine. Great. But on another side, we are a small country. We still have a problem that about 3,000 Jews were killed in Estonia. It's one half of a story. And another that we know that infamous Wannsee conference was chaired by Heydrich. And when they were designing and planning the final solution, on the place on the map where there was Estonia, there is a word that you can't be very proud of because it said Judenfrei. In other words, 3,000 Jews practically in 1 year have disappeared. And I must say that we have not resolved all these issues. We must work on it and we must understand what happened, how it happened, etc. We have special presidential commission that works for more 10 plus years. And by the way, there is one thing that I think that our work is done when one event happens in Jerusalem. When you go to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, then there is a dark corridor, and in the end there is a photo, huge photo, and it is from the only concentration camp in Estonia, and it's big words, Kloga. On one side we say, excuse me, it was not our fault. On another side, wasn't it our fault? Or perhaps we must think about it. So for us, this Kloga, this photo, is always there. And if we are talking about national self-consciousness, etc., we remember that, yes, not in big and large things, but there were bad things done in Estonia.
Igor, thank you for your honesty and your frankness and willingness to also to address this issue as well. So appreciate it. And Charlotte, it's always a pleasure to have you on the European Report. And of course, when we mentioned the Shoah, this is something that's very personal to you. So can you just give a brief overview of what happened to your parents during the Holocaust?
My parents were born between the two world wars. My mother in Kiev and my father in Berlin. And the story of both my parents is a lot of suffering, starvation during their youth, which we saw the results during our education. We are three girls, three sisters. On my mother's side, they escaped. They escaped thanks to a friend in the Red Army, and he was stealing passports to get on the train. And so there were 20 people from the family who could escape from Kiev to the east. And they were saved in Uzbekistan. But the grandparents of my mother, they were killed in Babi Yar because they were too old to move, and they said, we're staying. And they had the destiny of the Jews remaining in Kiev that has suffered from pogroms. I know that the mother of my grandmother was killed in a pogrom when the girls were, when my grandmother and her sister were 2 years old. And so my grandfather, he remarried three times, in fact. So this is on the side of my mother. This family escaped in Uzbekistan and were through Poland after the war, got into the country that is the country of our people, and they landed in Haifa. My father in Berlin grew up with 4 brothers and sisters and parents. The mother came from Budapest. On a study in the university in Berlin, she met Otto Gutman. And Otto Gutman was real German. He survived the First World War as a German soldier. He even fought in Bastogne in Belgium. He lost a brother, and the 3 remaining brothers lived in Germany after the First World War. They didn't. Otto Gutman was certain. He was German first of all. Then he was a Jewish citizen, but he was a German. And so he couldn't believe that all the restrictions, the laws, the decrees that were reducing the freedom of Jews in Germany were their problem. He considered that German Jews didn't have a problem. And so he was probably naive, didn't understand what was going on. And when he decided to pay the passports for his family to the Bolivian embassy, well, it was too late. And the question of timing is something that is very deep in me. And I'm very anxious that our generation would also somehow, in the future, suffering because of we see the evolution of politics in Europe, and not only of politics, because in this time in German Nazi, it was a governmental decision. All the decrees and laws were decided by the government. Today, it's more from the people. I feel that the people are more deciding if they're going to attack a Jew, a terrorist attack on Jews in Europe, or a synagogue, or whatever. So my father, was the only survivor of his family. Can I show this?
Of course you can, absolutely. Do you want to lift it a bit higher?
And this is a campaign that was organized by World Jewish Congress 2 years ago. And it's showing that we remember the people we lost that we even didn't know. Because here you have the mention of Maria Gutman, who was born in 37. Maria Gutman. 37, sorry. So she was 5-6 years old when she was taken with her mother and her elderly sister to Auschwitz, directly to the gas chambers.
Yeah. And Charlotte, thank you for bringing that to our attention, and thank you for sharing your touching story, because this is extremely personal to you and your family. Thomas, why is International Holocaust Memorial so important? Because, you know, the European Parliament, the European institutions honour and pay respect to this day, but how do we translate what happened to a younger generation who are sadly becoming ignorant of the horrors that took place on this continent nearly 80 years ago, as we approach the 80th anniversary of the start of the Second World War?
Yes, I believe it's exactly being confronted with the stories that we just heard. And it has to do about remembrance. There's an interesting quote in the Bible, I think it's in Exodus, when it says about there was a new leader in Egypt,
oh, yes,
a new Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. And today also, not remembering our past is such a huge tragedy. There's been a lot of surveys being conducted in the last few months. There's one by CNN, there's another one by the European Union. And one of them, for example, said that in France, the young people, 20% of the young French people haven't heard about the Holocaust. In Austria, where Hitler was born, 40% feel that they don't know enough about the Holocaust. In the United States, if you ask adult population to name one concentration camp, they cannot even name one. So I believe that the need for remembrance, and I remember just being born in 1963, for me, it was this TV series that came, I think, in the 70s, called the Holocaust, which was in a way brought this issue long overdue into national awareness. But that's a long time ago, and we really need something significant that can bring into popular culture and to these millennials, and to bring this story alive.
Yeah. And Igor, I have to really credit the European Commission, because they have decided to become permanent members of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and this is what they said in their, the EU Commission said in their press statement, and this is First Vice President Franz Timmermans quoted as saying, "With a decreasing number of Holocaust survivors at a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise, we need to foster the memory of the darkest chapter in our history. The EU is joining the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, will help to promote understanding so that future generations will heed the lessons from the past." What is your response to the way that the European Commission and the European Parliament are confronting the rise of Jew hatred in Europe?
I think Mr. Timmermans is right, but there is one thing we must understand. Many of our problems related to the Holocaust are related to oversimplification. There were Germans, they were bad Germans, then they Auschwitz, Oswiecim, etc., etc., and it was bad thing. I'd like to point at the fact that anti-Semitism is part of European culture, whether we like it or not. Let us think about Spanish Inquisition. Let's go back what was happening in southern France. It is somehow, to my mind, it's hypocrisy that we brush away Holocaust to Germans and forget that we are responsible for Holocaust. Yes, I am younger, etc., but my nation is responsible for that, period. When you see massive Holocaust, where much more Jews were killed than in Germany, what Stalin did, for goodness sake, where the Gulag concentration camp, etc., they were mainly Jews, and they were mainly workers, proletarians, craftsmen, the best professors, etc. Look at Soviet academicians. They name who were my teachers, Joffe and Rubinstein, etc. They were Jewish academicians sitting in Siberia. So I think, I'm sorry that I undertake this idea, but I think that that is the Holocaust, what we were talking about then. But there are tens of Holocausts before, and not a single nation except Jews have been the victims, because Jewish being victimized is for thousands of years. And even our church, and I belong to the Lutheran Church, we can't look into the looking glass honestly and say, we can as a church say, excuse me, but what we did to the Jews. So I think that if today we will pay more attention to the fact that we understand, you know, I do not like these stories when they hear talk about European values, value this, value that, value this. Okay, let's go back to Inquisition. Let's talk about the values. And let's talk about the concentration camps in Yugoslavia or the same Oswiecim, etc., etc., etc. Until we will not speak honestly that it is our common guilt, we as Europeans will never become as good as we want to be.
Profound, thank you so much. And you know, Charlotte, we're living in extraordinary times, aren't we? Primarily because there has never been so much Holocaust awareness. There are Hollywood blockbuster films made, books made, TV dramas made, education in our schools, and yet despite this, we're seeing an unprecedented rise of Jew hatred on this continent in Europe that is comparable to that of what happened in the 1930s and 40s. Do you have any reason explaining why we're seeing such a rise of Jew hatred?
Well, I have an opinion about this. My background is in communication and public relations, and I did a research on propaganda versus the ethics in public relations. And for me, it's all about propaganda. And the propaganda by the Nazis was not new, because it was the tools of this propaganda were already used by the other terrible Holocaust events that you mentioned. And if there is this propaganda that imposes the fear of people who are not Jews, because sometimes people are just becoming anti-Semitic because there was no other way to survive. If you were not denouncing Jews, or in Berlin, if you were not part of this move that was pro-Hitler, that was so amazing that my father often said to us, I didn't understand what was going on. Everybody was like in a trance. You say so in English?
Yep.
In trance. Yep. When he spoke and when he was present, and women fainted when he was passing in his car on the street. I mean, there was an atmosphere like for a star, movie star, or for a singer, famous singer. It was dramatic behaviors by people who had no sense of control anymore, but because they were also trapped. I think everybody was trapped in this strategy. The Jews were trapped in the different laws restricting their freedom more and more, and the other were trapped too, because if they were hiding Jews, which they did, and the right Jews among the nations are people who deserve more than a statue in Yad Vashem, because they really risked their life and the life of their families, because they took the risk to go against the orders and the laws. So for me, looking back in this kind of history, I say to myself and to my sisters, we are very lucky that we were born after the Second World War. I think it was the best period for Jewish people to recover, to find a new life, to have new hopes. And now there is again fear coming into our minds and our heads to think how long is this going to last? Are we going to remain optimistic about our future, or will we have to move again?
Yeah, which is sad. And Thomas, we're down to under 4 minutes of the programme, so I really have to conclude. What are your views going forward? I mean, it's great that the European Commission has endorsed the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. That also includes that anyone who says that Israel's a racist state, Israel has no right to exist, is deemed as being anti-Semitic. But what further steps and actions do you think the EU, its institutions and the European Parliament can take in order to eradicate this ancient hatred?
For me, the answer is rather straightforward. I was at the press conference just a few hours ago where the responsible commissioner were presenting a new survey on anti-Semitism, and I had the opportunity to ask a question. And my question was, don't you think that there is a relation between how European citizens perceive Israel as this big bad wolf, partly due by media reporting, but also by a message coming out from Brussels, and the level of anti-Semitism which we are experiencing. And I think that what the European Union needs to do, you cannot just limit this question and say, well, okay, we like the Jewish people as long as they live in Antwerp and Brussels and Birmingham and London. There needs to be a coherent policy. How can it be that if you would have the same survey in Israel today and they would ask you, how do you perceive the European Union? And we know that 80%, 90% perhaps would have a very negative view, perceiving Europe to be still, after all these years, the enemy, that don't understand the Jewish cause, that don't really care about the security of Israel. So I don't think that you can separate the two. And I know here it's in some circles, it's like the I word, which you can't mention. And it's like the elephant in the room. We have to build a bridge between the only Jewish state in the world. Why does it exist? Because Jews could not find safety anywhere else. And as Europeans, we have a responsibility for the safety and security of this Jewish state, just as much as we have for European Jewry. And this is really my main message.
Excellent. Igor, we're down to the last minute of the programme, so I give you the opportunity to stand up. How can we support brave and courageous MEPs like yourself who recognise the problem? And in your opinion, what can MEPs like yourself do to raise awareness and also help to confront this rise of Jew hatred that we're seeing across this continent today?
Actually, I don't think that there must be encouragement. We must simply find each other. That there are much more friends of Israel here around. We simply don't know them, and once in a while we'll meet on conferences, etc. And being member of Estonian National Parliament, we had a special group, and we communicated to our colleagues in Knesset, and people came here. Israel, by the way, has made a lot to secure Estonian independence. So he is also, strange enough, distance is big, but Israel is our military ally, by the way,
Wow.
who helps us. And the last year was interesting because it was last year, 10 years ago, it was Israeli 60th anniversary and Estonian 90th anniversary, and the governments of Israel and Estonia signed a joint logo that is 60 and 90 with two flags. With two flags. And I think that we must simply talk to people, and we must well, we love Jews, by the way, because if I travel in New York and Brighton Beach and whatever, if I listen to their jokes and if I listen to the best musicians everywhere, we love them, we like them, and we, you know, let's say, we can't call ourselves Zionists, I think, because we are not Jews. But I am Zionist, so I would say Zionists, Zionists of the world unite.
Excellent. Igor, thank you so much for being our guest on the programme, and Thomas as well, and to Charlotte as well. Just want to say on behalf of the European Report, we stand with Israel, we stand with the Jewish community, and we will do all we can to fight this rise of Jew hatred. And I want to thank you for watching today's European Report, filmed here in the European Parliament. It's important and imperative that all of us make a righteous and courageous stand against the rise of Jew hatred as we remember the International Holocaust Memorial Day. So thank you for watching today's European Report.